Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is the 7th video regarding this series, the question of Palestine, its roots or the roots of the Zionist settler colony. This video will focus on Israel and US, or the experience in Palestine and the experience in US. To talk about this, we need to have some brief background about Zionism in US. Its roots actually existed before Balfour Declaration. The Zionist Organization of America was established in 1897 during Herzl lifetime. And the American Jewish Committee was established in 1906 after the death of Herzl. But the American Jewish Committee was basically concerned about Jews in Russia. And then comes Associate Justice Brandeis. He was in the Supreme Court, as we knew before earlier, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. And Balfour Declaration was worked to get the American support for the declaration based on the recommendation of one of the cabinet in the British, one of the ministers in the British cabinet. It was said that you should take the approval of the United States before the declaration. And as you know, there was the First War going on, and they wanted the US to join the war, and some Jews somehow convinced the Balfour and other cabinet members that we can work to get United States join the war. And of course, in return, they need, you can work on the Balfour Declaration. So Justice Brandeis played a great role. He was, this is from Brandeis University website. He was not, at the early days, not active in the Zionist movement until he was in his late 50s. Then he was elected as the chair of the Provisional Committee for General Zionist Affairs in 1914, before the Balfour Declaration, and opened the New England Zionist office with his own money. While he was a justice of the Supreme Court, he continued to support the Zionist movement. And of course, the biggest support was convincing Wilson, the US president at that time, to agree on the Balfour Declaration. And we know that Balfour went to America and stayed there for 1 month. Imagine a foreign secretary visiting a country and spends there 1 month until he got the approval. But it continues. But as a Supreme Court justice, he was restricted from maintaining his other leadership roles. Now, further after that, US played a great role in the UN partition resolution. And Truman decided to recognize Israel immediately, despite an opposition from his own State Department. And this is coming from Truman Library. It says, President Truman regard for Secretary of State George Marshall was tremendous. The Secretary's opposition to recognition of a new Jewish state in Palestine troubled President Truman and resulted in the sharpest disagreement the two ever had. George Marshall is very well known Secretary of State. After the Second War, he promoted what is called Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after the destruction in the Second War. He was opposing Truman to recognize Israel, but somehow, for some reason, President Truman did not take his advice and recognize Israel. Now, in 1948, after the creation of the State of Israel, Menachem Begin visited New York. And we know his background. He had a terrorist organization called the Al-Arqam, and we know now, by now, we talked about this earlier, that he established his new party, Hirut, which means freedom, and then later on it turned to be Nahal, and at the end it turned to be the Likud. The current Likud is the same son of Nahal, the same son of Hirut, the same son of Al-Arqam, the terrorist organization. So Begin visited New York in 1948 to campaign for his party, Hirut. He was welcomed by many, but Albert Einstein and many other Jewish leaders opposed it. And he wrote a letter to the New York Times. It was signed by 28 noticeable names, Jewish intellectuals, rabbis, professionals, and leaders. And I will just read some segments from the letter. He says at the very beginning, among the most disturbing political phenomenon of our times is the emergence in the newly created state of Israel of the Freedom Party, Hirut, a political party closely akin in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties. It was formed out of the membership of and following of the former Ergon Zavi Lumi, a terrorist, right-wing, chauvinist organization in Palestine. The current visit of Menachem Begin, leader of this party, to the United States is obviously calculated to give the impression of American support for his party in the coming Israeli elections, and to cement political ties with the conservative Zionist elements in the United States. Several Americans of national repute have lent their names to welcome his visit. This is what Einstein's letter says. It is inconceivable that those who oppose fascism throughout the world, if correctly informed as to Mr. Begin's political record and perspectives, could add their names and would support their support to the movement he represents. And it concludes by the following: the discrepancies between the bold claims now being made by Begin and his party and their record of past performance in Palestine bear the imprint of no ordinary political party. This is the unmistakable stamp of a fascist party for whom terrorism against Jews, Arabs, and British alike and mispresentation are means, and a leader state, between two quotes, is the goal. In the light of the foregoing considerations, it is imperative that the truth about Mr. Begin and his movement be made known in this country, in the United States. It is all the more tragic that the top leadership of American Zionism had refused to campaign against Begin's efforts, or even to expose to its own constituents the dangers to Israel from support to Begin. The undersigned, therefore, take this means of publicly pressuring a few salient facts concerning Begin and his party, and of urging all concerned not to support the latest manifestation of fascism. We know, like we said, that Begin changed his party to be Likud, and he follows what is called revisionist Zionism, which was promoted by Jabotinsky And the current team, Netanyahu and his cabinet, belong to this fascist Nazi terrorist group. Likud mother was Herot party, which of course, like we said, emerged from Ergon organization. Now, there is one question remain we need to ask. Why do we find this support to the Zionist settler colony in the US? One reason can be because of the role of the American Zionism and Christian Zionism. Another reason, the resemblance between both projects. Both are colonial projects. Here comes another writing written by Professor Gary Hess. Gary Hess was a distinguished research professor and was an American diplomat at Bowling Green State University, Ohio. He wrote an abstract for a PhD dissertation submitted by Robert McDonald in 2012. Robert McDonald wrote his dissertation about a land without people, for people without land, civilizing mission, and American support for Zionism from 1880s to 1929. That was his dissertation. And Dr. Gary, who was the supervisor for this dissertation, he himself wrote the abstract. Very interesting abstract. He wrote the full writing is available in the dissertation is available in PhD format in the internet, and I got the abstract from that. He said the dissertation focuses on how the Zionists presented their argument for Jewish colonization of Palestine to the West in pamphlets, books, speeches, petitions, interviews, meetings with officials. He says in the early stage and their supporters presented their colonial movement to the Western powers as an extension to the Western civilization mission, adopting the idealistic rhetoric of benevolent imperialism and biblical justifications of earlier settler colonies such as the United States. The Zionists presented their movement as similar, very consistent with the history of the white Americans, essentially characterizing Jewish pioneers and the Jewish colonization of Palestine in such a way as to remind the white Americans of how they understood themselves and their history of settlement, conquest, and expansion. Consequently, the abstract says, Zionists and white Americans understood the religious population of Palestine as congregous with with Native Americans. So in America, when the whites, according to him, came to this country, it was inhabited by Native Americans. There it was inhabited by Palestinians. So both Zionists and the white Americans understood the similarity between those indigenous populations. Palestinians means Native Americans, and simply compounded the already negative attitude Americans often exhibited towards Islam and the people of the Orient. The Jewish colonization of Palestine began during the final stage of the US conquest of Native Americans. This is what Dr. says in his abstract. And white Americans justified the removal, the exportation, and extermination of the natives on the prevailing ideologies of civilization and race. Zionists would adopt a similar ideology and strategy of conquest regarding the Palestinian Arabs, whose possession of the land and existence represented an obstacle to the Zionist goals, primarily the establishment of a Jewish state. By the way, in 1851, the Congress passed what is known the Indian Appropriations Act, creating the Indian reservation system, Native Americans are not allowed to leave their reservations without a permission. This is exactly what Israel did for Arabs after the Nakba. I saw pictures, they surrounded some of their towns with siege, with fence. And you cannot leave from one town to another town without a permission from the military ruler. Martial laws were declared on all Arab cities and towns. Very same practices that had been carried out by this Indian Appropriations Act. No Indian was allowed without permission to leave the reservation without permission. No Palestinian, Muslim or Christian, was allowed to leave their town without permission from the marshal, from the military governor in that town. So this tells us that there is resemblance in the two experiences, and this explains why do some people show sympathy with and support actually to the Zionist settler colony in Palestine. Now, there are aspects of it, of course, need further discussion and further research. As I mentioned in the first video, it's not meant to give extensive history to the issue. The issue, if you want to study it extensively, you need, I would say, 3 college courses to cover all aspects, starting from Palestine before Islam, then Palestine maybe during the Crusaders and after, then the Ottomans and the current one, or the Crusader and the Ottomans and the current experience. Whatever it can be divided. But my point is not these details. The point is that what is meant by these videos is just to give the audience some general idea about the history of this issue. The history did not start on October 7th. That's the point. Its history goes beyond than that. Even the history of the Nakba goes beyond than that. So to reduce the whole conflict as a natural conflict, natural things to what happened in October 7th is not fair and does not give the audience a fair idea, background about the conflict. We need to go beyond than that, and even beyond than 48, to have good idea about this project. So this is the 7th video, and inshallah next video will be about after Zionism, and or a conclusion for this series, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.